What's up, folks? Nate here at Two Old Dyno Works. It is a late night here in the shop, but Derek and I have just finished getting our 2025 Yamaha R9 properly put back together and dialed in for track duty tomorrow because we're finally taking this thing out for its maiden voyage over Pacific Raceways. Now, just looking at the bike, at first glance, it might just look like a stock bike with an exhaust system on it, but that really couldn't be further from the truth. The only reason we still have the stock bodywork on this thing is that next door at the paint shop, our bodywork isn't ready yet. We have the race bodywork for this bike, so for this first track test, we're going to go ahead and just stick with the OEM bodywork, but that's really about where the OEM components stop. As I've already mentioned in the previous videos that we've shown with testing and tuning on this bike, we've replaced the cams with Giacomoto's V1 race cams for the CP3 engine, we've got the full Acura installed, and we've got a DNA Stage 2 kit in the intake. Those combination of parts with our custom ECU mapping has the bike making about 126 horsepower and 70 pound-feet of torque exactly to the tire on pump gas. If you take a closer look at the brakes, you'll actually see that while we still have the OEM calipers and rotors in place, because these are fantastic calipers that come on these bikes from the factory, we have actually replaced the brake lines with a set of lines from Cormoto that allowed us to delete the ABS. Because if you've ever been at any proper pace on a racetrack with a modern motorcycle that has ABS, you'll know that it's a terrible time. You just can't get around the fact that all of a sudden the stopping power is pulled away from you when the ABS system kicks in and your lever just goes to mush. It's not fun and it's not safe. We've also done the same thing here on the rear brakes as well. Again, stock master cylinder, but replace it with a Cormoto line while we've removed the rest of the ABS system. When removing the ABS system on any of these modern bikes, there's a couple different ways to go about doing it, but the way that we always prefer is to actually just leave the OEM ABS module in place. There's lots of different delete kits and resistors and dongles out there that you can install to go ahead and remove the entirety of the ABS block and module and just plug in with these little dongles or resistors. But in our personal experience, they're often prone to failure, and I've actually had one fail on me mid-race on track where all of a sudden it just lost wheel speed data when it failed internally, and I had no wheelie control and traction control coming out of a very fast corner Pacific Raceways and almost ended up on my face. So it only took me one time of having a failure like that nearly cause a crash for me to decide we're never doing it that way again. We will always just run the stock ABS modules on these bikes if we're still working with the stock electronics, which we are here on these R9s, because the OEM ABS modules, while they might weigh 1.5 pounds more than those little ABS delete dongles or resistors, are bulletproof from a reliability standpoint. Now, as far as the chassis is concerned, there's obviously a lot going on here. We've got one of Attack's progressive links installed. We have an Öhlins TTX GP shock. We have the much longer XSR 900 swing arm. We have a set of Öhlins Nix 30 fork kits, while the FKRs that we're waiting for are still on back order. We've got a set of the Evil Technology triples with some variable offsets in there. But I'm really not the right guy to talk about this stuff. 99% of my day is focused on modern engine electronics and tuning. There's somebody much more versed in these particular motorcycles than I am that's done far more chassis testing than pretty much anybody else I know on the continent, and he was actually nice enough to go ahead and take some time out of his busy schedule to chat with us earlier about it, and I'm just going to go ahead and share that recorded phone call with you guys so he can explain to you what he's done to the bike, because we've essentially mirrored the changes that he's made and the improvements that it's going to have when it comes to the chassis. So somebody that's a lot more familiar with the chassis, the brakes, these bikes in general, than we are here at Two Old Dyno Works is probably this guy, Josh Hayes. You and Bryce have developed a pretty killer machine that you've been racing now at Moto America in the Super Sport Series this season. And I figured that I'd appreciate your time getting you on the phone, so thank you very much, just to kind of talk to guys about where this bike is in terms of the OEM chassis setup and what you guys have found and done so far to really get it set up and to get ready to go racing on the track.
All right. First, I would say, getting to ride the production bike has been pretty fun. I actually went and rode this weekend, had Melissa and I go out and do some laps on some standard R9s. And for sure, the bike has a very unique feel that is different from a lot of the DNA of the other Yamahas that I've ridden. But I will say this. The bike is very, very easy to ride. It is incredibly stable. For people looking for a stable bike that they can push on hard, even with the standard suspension, man, it's just they put a lot of adjustability into it so that you do a couple of turns on the preload on the shock, a little bit of the valving stuff. I actually have gotten it where with race rubber, I could ride the thing effort-wise incredibly hard. and the bike, it never moves. It doesn't shake, it doesn't wiggle, it doesn't give you all the excitement that you typically get from something like an R6 or an R1.
Sure.
It's just stable. So the biggest thing that I find to be the issue is a little bit ground clearance. Overall, the bike's pretty low, and
Yep.
it's not even. It's getting my feet off the ground, so it's not even just like how wide the cases look and feel on the bike, but I haven't drug any hard parts other than getting into the side stand a little bit. But
Oh,
I think if
nice.
you could just stiffen the thing up and get it up a little bit, you just kind of catch that extra long tab that you use your foot to kick the side stand down with. I caught the end of that once or twice. So, but I mean, the bike really is a joy to ride, very forgiving, and it's kind of muted from the excitement of some of the other race bikes. So it really allows you to dig into it and get aggressive with the lever and the throttle and things like that. And the bike's pretty friendly to ride with a full suite of electronics that are pretty solid, I think. So.
I couldn't agree more, which is why we've stuck with the stock electronics because obviously we're not racing it in the Super Sport series. We don't have to go to the extent that you guys do for class balancing to get the kit electronics on the bike. And I don't think many track day guys and club racers are going to go to that expense either because the kits are just super expensive. But obviously, you guys have to have them for Moto America Super Sport. So on the chassis side of things, what then have you guys changed? Because again, you and I have already talked off camera about this extensively, but just for everybody here watching this, what have you changed on the bike and what are you looking to accomplish with those changes as far as the chassis is concerned?
Well, for one thing, they've allowed quite a few parts that they call the kit. Okay. And this was
Mm-hmm.
all developed by Yamaha Europe. So, quite honestly, some of this stuff we don't exactly know where it came from and how extensive their testing was.
Sure.
But I do know that they ran into a few hangups and needed some changes for a few reasons. And they wanted to keep the parts readily available. So, one of the big talking points, of course, is the Tracer 900 swing arm that gets
Yep.
modified into the bike and that was tested on the MT09. The swing arm on the R9 is the same as the MT09 swing arm.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, there are two things that stand out about the swing arm. One is the Tracer 900 has a large cast piece in the front of the swing arm, which I believe the R9 and MT09 is all kind of a welded box section aluminum.
Right.
So putting that piece in, I'm sure added rigidity around the swing arm pivot, but I can't say that between riding the standard bike and riding the full race bike that I notice a big difference in that. The other thing is the length of the Tracer swing arm is incredibly long. And that has, I think, both its good and bad. I think it's probably a little longer than what was anything that might be necessary.
Yeah, for
Riding a
sure.
stock bike, it really didn't have a huge effect. But the big thing was with the MT09 or the R9 swing arm, when you start putting the big race rubber on there, you get limited on gearing options. You're going to have to run in the back half of the swing arm because the tire is just too big to fit, and you're not going to be able to get warmers on it if you run it very tight
Right.
with gearing or whatever might happen in the swing arm. And I think that was one of the bigger issues that they had in World Supersport. I think that the tire is really, really big,
Mm-hmm.
and they just needed more space to work with, and that was the only option available that came from another Yamaha model, and that was pretty seamlessly integrated into the bike.
Yeah, they had to
So,
homologate something from Yamaha, and it drops right in. But like you said, it's 70 millimeters longer than stock, which is an enormous wheelbase change.
yeah, it actually, you know, and honestly, physically, you can see it, and it really stands out. And I mean, if you watch World Supersport, if you watch what we're doing, these things are drag bikes. They are incredible on starts. T.
Yep.
Hobbs and I went testing at Podium Club with the ASMA guys from Arroyo Seco, their series.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of us, we were 1 and 2 out of turn 1 after starting on the 6th row of a middleweight race.
That's hilarious.
At a local race. So they're almost unfair how good they launch
Sure.
and how quick they get going forward. The hardest part is getting your foot on the shifter fast enough in first gear. You just about
Yep.
can't get there with the low rev limit that's on the bike. By the time you get the clutch out, you're panicking to get a shift in already.
Right.
As far as the chassis goes, though, we actually did ride it with the long swing arm and the standard link. And the big thing was you just really had to get the bike stiff to be able to hold it up. Otherwise, everything drags on the ground.
Yeah.
So, one thing with the standard link is yes, you can run that swing arm and you're going to need quite a bit of rock. We had 110 to 115 Newton shock springs.
Yeah.
You still see me? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's just a quick glitch there. I've got you.
Um, so yeah, we ended up riding around Chuckwalla that way and still going pretty fast with the bike. And then we got for our team, we got the Evol Tech Link,
Hmm.
which is very very similar to the Attack Link. And
Right.
with that, you immediately get a pretty big boost in ride height, which will give us swing arm angle and get some more grip into the bike just with that. And it's actually so stiff that we ended up going quite a bit softer on spring rates.
Hmm.
Though we kind of kept some big valving in it because with that long arm, you have a lot of leverage on the shock. So we wanted to
Right.
control that stuff pretty quickly. The other thing being, the other things that stood out were, of course, we worked on position a little bit, but now we're allowed to do the cups and the clamps in the front of the bike, which is a
Yep.
full next gen super sport thing. And so being able to do that whenever we got the bike up pretty tall, it was hard to have the geometry in the front that we needed to get the bike to turn well. And you either turned it into a unicycle, when you started getting it up in the air. So we're running the Öhlins cartridges in the front, running at 130 mil of travel, and with the Evol Tech clamps and the cups, we found ourselves trying to get to these trail numbers and rake numbers that made sense to us from the other
Hmm.
bikes that we had ridden and get the right feeling on the front end. And we've kind of been back and forth, but for the most part, we're running the bike pretty tall in the front. Uh, Typically, with the Evol clamp or even with the stock clamp, it was pretty high, where we only have maybe the cap showing on the fork. If
Yep.
not, it buried and recessed down in there a little bit. And incredibly stiff spring rates, and we've had the thing raked out pretty far to keep everything in the normal range and not run out of that trail where the bike actually can flick and ride okay. I rode a bike this weekend, we tried going even taller on the rear and trying some things and got it pretty steep and got the trail numbers down pretty low, and the grip was pretty incredible. The bike stopped okay, but I just felt like I was missing a little bit of grip in the middle of some of the faster corners. And
Gotcha.
so, we've been just looking for the right feeling, but we've kind of stayed between the 1.5 and 2 degree cups, quite honestly, and been able to fiddle with offset a little bit to come up with that feeling that we're looking for.
So I think that's going to be what a lot of guys are going to find as really beneficial information, because obviously it takes a lot of time to go ahead and experiment with the offsets and the different adjusters that come with the cups from somebody like Evil or from like the Attack clamps, for example. So that 1.5 to 2 degrees, is that about where you would recommend most guys start?
I think once we're getting the bike up there, you're going to end up in that range.
Hmm.
And the standard 25 offset is probably about as far as you're going to go out. You're probably
Yeah,
going to end up between there and the 23, and you start getting into something that feels a little more what you're accustomed to riding. It still has the muted feel from the engine, but the
sure.
chassis starts making a lot more sense of being able to get over it. It's just a unique chassis because Yamaha had an engine that was established that they're like, we're going to use this.
Yep.
And so to create a frame around that, the bike is quite a bit different in balance than it ever was with the R1 and the R6. And that's
Right.
part of what I said. The DNA just feels different. And I believe that part of that is it feels like the steering neck got moved really far out away from you and in front of you. So you feel a lot more behind the front tire than on top of it.
Hmm.
And so that's been a significant change in feel for me. And maybe that's why Matt Skoltz has found this thing to be quite the unicorn for himself, because he sat pretty far back on the motorcycle anyway and behind that
Sure.
tire. And so it tends to give him that feeling that might be a little more familiar that he's been looking for.
Sure. You're not exactly going slow on the thing yourself, though. I mean, you are absolutely hauling the mail on that R9. And I think previously when you and I chatted, you are now approaching lap times in just a very early amount of development that you and Bryce have done on this bike that you are already seeing on the R6 platform that has been just developed to the moon over the last 20 years.
Yeah, no, we've tested at quite a few tracks. We tested at Chuckwalla, we tested at Podium Club, all places where I'd done quite a few laps on our next gen R6 that we did CVMA with earlier in the year.
Mhm.
That was a pretty strong bike. I was able to really do strong lap times with, and we have outperformed those lap times at every racetrack. Just the braking prowess, the jump off the corner. It doesn't quite have the legs of the R6, so it's
Sure.
different feel, and it's taken some time to understand when to shift the bike And a lot of people, or even me in the beginning, I was lugging the bike a lot, and we've kind of moved away from that. Where now we're actually using the RPM and keeping the thing going. And yeah, everywhere we go, we seem to be getting stronger and stronger with it. And it's been tough for the first couple of races. I got a little lucky with my rain race and getting a win in there. In
Hmm.
the dry, I've been experimenting probably a little too much. You know, we have a young team,
Hmm.
and all of us as a group in pro racing, I'm probably the most experienced guy, the next being
Definitely.
Bryce. And then our crew is a lot of young guys that are kind of new to riding at this level. And so I've been kind of throwing things at the wall, even at the last second, going out into races with a bike that I haven't ridden before
Yeah.
and making more significant changes than I've made in the past. And I'm going to have to go back to taking my own advice. I think moving forward here, I think we have a pretty good motorcycle, and now I got to figure out how to extract the most out of it a little bit better.
Yeah, you and Bryce have definitely done more testing than anybody else I've talked to that's running the CP3 platform here. But I definitely think that you guys are going to be right there at the front. I can't imagine how you wouldn't be with just the sheer volume of time you've now put into this thing. Because I can't speak for any of the other teams that I've talked to, but you guys seem like you're out there on this thing constantly, just trying to find any little edge you possibly can. And I'd be willing to bet that shows pretty quick.
I'm impressed. Bryce is a young business owner, and he's
Mhm.
been a racer, and it's worked to my advantage because, it's funny when we talked before the season about even going racing. We had the conversation where he's like, "Oh, I think I can do this, this, this," and I go, "I don't think you know how expensive this is going to be." I think I got this, and now he's like, "Oh wow, man, I'm spending some money,"
Mhm.
but he has not shorted us in any way. He's been true to his word, and he's committed to doing it. We have a lot of good racetracks local to him in Bakersfield, having two circuits at Buttonwillow, Willow Springs, Streets of Willow, Chuckwalla Podium Club. So we've had a lot of opportunities, and he loves being at the racetrack. So every opportunity we get, we go out and we get to try some new things. He's even riding the bike and trying some things and wants to understand it. And yeah, we've been able to get a lot of laps in and learn a lot of things. And yeah, I definitely hope it starts paying off.
Mhm.
And like I said, I think if I from here start focusing a bit more on my riding and me, and I think I can, we go to these tests and I extract some pretty good lap times out of it. I go to the
Mhm.
race and I'm not doing my best lap times when it counts. And so I think I've shown some competitiveness in the dry a few times, but I haven't done it when it counted. And I'm going to go focus on that moving forward.
Well, we're certainly rooting for you guys. And just me personally, I was actually shocked and honestly impressed when I did talk to Bryce because after you and I chatted last, I spent probably 30, 40 minutes on the phone with him. I don't know many other team owners or general managers that will actually get out there and throw their own leg over a bike to go do the hard testing and R&D with riders like Bryce has been doing with you guys. And
Yeah.
there's not a lot of folks that I talk to because, we're all really kind of specialized and segmented here in the industry. I focus almost entirely on engine electronics and data, and I could have a incredibly intelligent conversation with Bryce just right off the bat. The guy absolutely knows what he's doing, and I think you guys are going to have some really great success later this season.
Yeah, I think he's taken to the other side, not just the riding part. He's
Hmm.
taken to the other side of like building these bikes and enjoys a lot of those parts of it, and it's showing in his work. And yeah, he's out testing and riding, and we discuss the things. He's not out going, "Oh, I found the trick setup." He'll say, "Hey,
Totally.
I felt this thing. It rides like something that feels normal to me," and we both talk quite a bit because we have quite a different riding style.
Hmm.
And so it was funny. We went this weekend and he rode the bike quite a bit and said, "Okay, I think this is pretty good." And I went out and smashed the thing flat. And it was like, he was typically I went a little bit, I went a good bit faster than him, but it was
Hmm.
like I buried the front of the bike and barely
Yeah.
used the rear, where he is typically deeper in the rear and barely uses the front. So,
Right.
we're also learning just from each other of like, okay, we both feel these things. So these are inherent to the motorcycle, even if our riding styles are different. And then,
Right.
of course, young Teague's doing a really good job too. So he actually was in front of me when he tipped over at Road Atlanta, was riding really well.
Saw
At
that.
Podium Club, he shows some really good pace at Podium Club. And I think he's really excited to be a part of a young team, and everybody's fired up, and we're just having so much fun.
Well, that's awesome to hear, man. And I obviously do sponsor Max Van and the Sport Bike Track Your team now that he's on M4. But besides Max, I can honestly say that I think most of the guys here will be rooting for you other than him. So I really do wish you guys all the best. I really hope you and Bryce get out there in the front. I'm pretty confident you'll get there on this bike, but I'd certainly love to see it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Hey, don't worry. I'm a fan of Max too. I spent the last year coaching him. So.
I know you did. Yeah, you and I talked a lot out there last year at the Ridge in his trailer. So
yeah, we still talk quite a bit at the track. You know, he was pitted right next to us on pit lane in Atlanta, and his dad and I would be laughing when the weather wasn't so good, and he'd be like, "You're about to go out on slicks, aren't you?" And I'd be like, "Probably."
Yep.
So
well, that's awesome.
Yeah,
well, hey, I really appreciate you just taking the time to chat with us and to share kind of what you guys have learned at the very tippy top of what we do here in North America racing. And that way, guys, again, can just kind of jump the curve a little bit, because it's obviously, as you know, a really steep learning curve on a brand new chassis and platform that none of us have any experience on. And you just being able to kind of share the setup information that you have, I think will give guys a much bigger head start than they would have had otherwise getting these things dialed in for the track. So thank you again very much for your time.
Yeah, no problem. And like I said, in standard form, if you can just get that thing up in the air a little bit and stiffen it up, I think it's going to be a pretty good bike because it's so mellow.
Now, one thing that Josh and I did forget to talk about when we were doing that phone call earlier was a steering damper. We've obviously got a steering damper on the bike. Running a race bike without one is more or less insane. I don't know if I'm impressed that these bikes didn't come with one from the factory because they really just weren't necessary with how insanely stable the OEM chassis is, or if Yamaha was just trying to save a few bucks. But either way, you're going to want one, and the bikes don't come with one. So we've got one installed on here. It's just a standard 68mm Öhlins SD001, I believe is the exact part number, with a custom bracket from our friend Chuck Giacchetto at Giac Moto. And obviously we've had to chop away some of the bodywork to get this all to fit and clear on the bike. Now, there are much better looking steering damper brackets that will be available very, very shortly than what you see there on the bike. That's something Chuck just created for us quickly on his lathe at his shop. Again, really appreciate you getting that over to us so we can get out on the track tomorrow with a damper installed. But once they're actually available to the public and you guys can purchase them, they'll be a much cleaner setup than we've had to do there. That's really just the only solution we had at this point. So yours is not going to look quite like what we've got going there, but you definitely want an Öhlins steering damper on the bike to go with the rest of the Öhlins suspension. Now, there's a few more things still worth mentioning actually that we've installed on the rear arm on this bike. Attack Performance makes a really cool set of both Superbike lifters and a sprocket and chain cover for these bikes. As you can see here on the other side, it both acts as the sprocket cover or the shark guard, which you need to have for race use to cover up the sprocket and the chain, and it also acts as a Superbike lifter, which we thought was a pretty cool piece, so we went ahead and installed those as well. And we've obviously also got a set of the Litec adjusters. They're stronger than the OEM ones, they allow for more precise adjustment than the OEM ones, and it's why it's pretty much everybody's choice of chain adjuster on any modern motorcycle. So we've now covered the engine performance and the electronics, we've covered the brakes, we've covered the chassis. Let's dive into the ergonomics. For the rear sets, we've gone with the rear sets from Attack Performance. There's almost infinite adjustability here with these things. They're incredibly lightweight, they're stupidly strong, they look fantastic. The grip on this thing, if you can really see that there in the camera, is nuts. They are just overall some of the best rear sets currently on the market, and that's why we put them on the bike, period, end of story. But for the clip-ons, we did something a little different. I did originally try the clip-ons from Attack Performance, and while they look like they would work fantastic for possibly a smaller rider, both myself and Mark DeGrosse, who's going to be riding the bike, are not small jockeys. So just sitting on the bike with the clip-ons from Attack, which are more tangent designed, so it is essentially in line with the fork here, instead of sitting in front of it, and are lower down, because these are a 1-inch riser, I just felt like the thing was a little bit too just sort of forward-leaning and on the nose. Mark and I both like a much more relaxed and laid-back position. We like the bars up a little bit higher so we can give it a little bit more leverage. So we went with the 1-inch front mount risers from our friends over at Woodcraft to go ahead and get the hand controls properly dialed in for what we want on these bikes. Now, along with replacing the clip-ons with these Woodcraft 1-inch front mount risers, we also replaced the grips and the throttle tube. The throttle tube is something that a lot of you folks are absolutely going to want. The stock throttle tube on this R9 has a pretty long throw, but underneath this Renthal grip, we actually have a prototype of a quick turn throttle from TST that shortens the total throttle turn needed to go from 0 to 100% down to 56 degrees, which makes this effectively a 1/6 turn throttle, and it is a huge improvement over the factory tube. Now, I'm sure a bunch of you just noticed that there's actually 4 zip ties holding our ignition switch onto our Evil Technology triple clamp right now. And that's because there's really no other solution at the moment as the time I'm shooting this video on the R9. With the stock electronics still in place, and by that I mean the stock wiring harness and ECU and dash, you still have to have an ignition switch. There's currently no key delete out there for the 4th generation CP3 electronics, so you've just got to have it and there's no other way around it. Us zip tying it right here to the triples, kind of in its sort of native position where it sits with the stock triples, just made the most sense, and that's why it's there. Now, when it comes to crash protection, let's face it, we're going racing. It's probably going to happen at some point. You want to protect the case covers. Woodcraft makes a killer set of case savers for these bikes, so we've installed them here on both sides. You also are probably going to start seeing some folks coming out with different frame sliders out there for these bikes, and we actually won't be running any. Not only would any frame slider involve modifying the stock bodywork somewhere to go ahead and get that mounted properly, but especially with a race bodywork in place, there's just really no need for it. A frame slider is not going to save these big pretty wings from hitting the ground because it would have to stick out to like here, which is just nuts. Like that's never going to happen. The bigger issue for us is that even if you have race bodywork on, when you put a frame slider there, you've all of a sudden added a significant portion of leverage, or essentially a long end of a lever out there in space. So if you ever end up crashing this thing at any kind of high speed, and that big puck that you've got sticking out here digs into the ground, what ultimately happens more often than not is the bike starts tumbling. It catches that big puck, goes up in the air, and then the damage gets massively worse. I don't really care if we have to replace bodywork. In the grand scheme of things, that's cheap. When the bike starts tumbling and all of a sudden you're smashing wheels and swing arms and forks, shit gets real expensive real fast, and I'm just not interested. So we really never recommend, especially on bikes that are going to be spending a lot of time on the track, running frame sliders for really any platform. All right, we're kind of on the home stretch here, folks, but there's still more parts we've replaced that you're going to want to know about, so stick with me here. Right out of the box, these bikes come with a 525 pitch chain, which is overly large and heavy and doesn't really need to be on the bike. You're obviously going to have to replace the chain as well because it's just significantly longer with this much longer swing arm in place. So when we did that, we decided to go ahead and go with the DID ERV7 chains and a 520 pitch and the Superlight sprockets in the rear and the front to match. Now the ERV7 chain from DID is not cheap. It is high quality stuff. Even in a 520 pitch, they last an incredibly long amount of time. And the reason we stick with that stuff is that I've ran less expensive 520 chains that are out there on the market, and unfortunately, I've personally experienced failures. Just like the ABS deletes I've experienced failures for, it really only takes one try for a sprocket or a chain to fail on the bike before you decide you're never going to do that shit again. So the DID ERV7 chain is the only thing we'll be using here at Tool Dynoworks, along with those Superlight sprockets. Now, I'm not going to get into individual gearing recommendations on these bikes because anybody making a gearing recommendation that isn't track specific, and I mean a individual track specifically, is giving you bad advice because the optimal gearing needs for one track versus another can be completely different from one to another, and that's something you should use, say, like the gearing calculator at gearingcommander.com to go ahead and help you figure out. You're also going to need to change the gearing because if you're running slicks, like the Pirellis that we're running here in the 190/60, they are way taller than the OEM 180/55 tires. And that much taller rear tire acts like changing the gearing all by itself because it now takes the thing significantly longer to rotate that much larger tire diameter than it did with the stock one. So gearing adjustments, especially if you're going to be running slicks, is a must. And lastly, to wrap up this video of all the parts we've replaced thus far on the bike, is what we've got here on the tank. You need a keyless gas cap if we're hopefully eventually going to get rid of the ignition switch entirely because, well, you don't want to be carrying around your key to have to get into the fuel cap when you're at the racetrack. So we went ahead and just got one of the Vortex caps off the 24 MT09s. They fit perfectly on the R9 tank. They're a direct bolt up. We've also got some tank grips on here. These are really just generic grips I had from some of our MTs that we had laying around. I just didn't want to scratch the crap out of the tank before we get it wrapped because the next time you guys see this thing in a more in-depth video, this will all be black. The bodywork's all going to be black with the race bodywork we have on there. But we are going to be out on the track all day tomorrow with this bike. You do need a little bit more traction than the sort of OEM paint job provides when you're really leaning this thing over and trying to lock your leg against the tank. And, well, I just don't want to scratch the shit out of it either. So some of these tank pads are definitely going to help us out on both fronts. And that's it. That's everything we've done and installed and swapped out on our 2025 Yamaha R9 as of when I'm shooting this video at sometime at stupid o'clock here on May 20th, 2025. Now, obviously, there's additional components that we will be covering and replacing. I still have a stock battery in here. That's a huge weight savings. I honestly just forgot to order one. We'll go ahead and replace that when we go ahead and swap out all the bodywork as well and really trim the fat off this bike with all the weight savings that that provides. I have the stock brake pads still on the bike. I've spent very little time riding this bike on the street because the weather here has sucked recently, let alone on the racetrack. I'm pretty sure the brake pads are not going to be amazing for racetrack performance, but we'll find out tomorrow, and I'll obviously do all of this so I can share that feedback with you guys so you know before you start spending your hard-earned money on upgrades and parts for your new R9. So if you want to see more of this as we continue to evolve our bike and we go through all of our testing and tuning on this platform, like the video, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and be sure to follow along because we'll be covering much, much more of this as time goes on throughout the rest of the season here at Two Wheel Dyno Works.